All right, everyone. So I have titled my talk today Research Justice, which is a conceptual and methodological framework I have been building for a while with comrades here in Los Angeles. And I wanted to share this with you today because I think it's especially pertinent for planning praxis. I'm going to argue today that research justice is a necessary component of spatial justice, that it must include not only principles of accountability and reciprocity, but also practices thereof, and that it entails nodes of knowledge making premised on the recognition that social movements actively make knowledge and produce theory. Research justice has been at the heart of the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, for which I've had the great privilege of serving as founder here at UCLA, and we celebrated the Institute's 10th anniversary earlier this year. The Institute has been founded on a few key principles, one of which is to focus explicitly on inequality, race and class inequality, to take a global approach to this. We worked a lot with W.E.B. Du Bois's idea of color lines and Du Bois's argument that the color line belts the world. But we've also seen these color lines as front lines, that we as scholars have to be present on these front lines, and in doing so, we have to undertake a reparative approach to justice. So in our work, we accompany movements and communities on the front lines of dispossession and displacement, and do so with the intent of actively dismantling structures of inequality. I share this slide because I also know that there's so many students here, and I wanted to give you a quick sense. I'm not going to go through all of these ideas, but a quick sense of the scholarly inspiration for our work, and in particular to think with scholars like Clyde Woods, who received a PhD in urban planning from my department, UCLA, well before I got to UCLA. And Woods' argument that it is not enough for us to do an autopsy of suffering or inequality. We have to be more than what Woods calls academic coroners. We have to think about the difference that our work makes in the world. And I'll return to some of these ideas at various points, but in particular, as we set out to create the Institute in 2015, 2016, we were also very inspired by this manifesto that I'm sure many of you are also inspired by, which invites us to think differently about the university, that challenges us to transform the university that we inhabit as a key institution, and to think about how we build in places of racial capitalism, how we build what Harney and Mertens calls the undercommons, a place of fugitive study, a place where we make change and where we refuse to leave the world as it is intact. Now, it's difficult very much to think about research justice on stolen land. And I say this because I've also been thinking for a while now about planning on stolen land. That's a talk I gave at an ASOP conference a while ago, and I will say that it created quite a bit of controversy because planners had a very difficult time, at least at that point, in thinking about their role in relation to stolen land. But I think it's absolutely crucial that we recognize that our universities themselves are on stolen land. So my university, the University of California, Los Angeles, sit on the unceded territories of the Tongva people. And in addition to this, in addition to the fact that we literally sit on land that has been stolen via the Morrill Act of 1862, which created land-grant universities, better understood as land grab universities, that in addition to this, many of our universities, our powerful universities, continue practices of land grabs, of extraction, of poor employment practices, and of an investment, if you will, in warfare. So I'm very inspired by this book by Davarian Baldwin that some of you might be familiar with, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, where Professor Baldwin reminds us of the colonial racial logics that continue today at our universities, not only in the form of stolen land, but also in the political economy of our universities. And I share this because research justice as a framework is meant to undo these colonial racial logics. So Baldwin writes in this book, I quote, universities have become the dominant employers, real estate holders, healthcare providers, and even policing agents in major cities across the country. And the lower income neighborhoods and communities of color that stand in the immediate path of campus expansion, while in deep need of new investments, are left the most vulnerable. These residents face increased housing costs or even displacement amid university land developments. Many of the same black and brown urbanites also toil in the low-wage sectors of the higher education workforce as groundskeepers and food service staff, and they often endure violence and surveillance from campus police forces. So Baldwin's analysis highlights the ways in which US universities benefit from their invocation of the public good, from tax exemptions to eminent domain powers in order to build endowments and accumulate land. And I'm equally interested in how universities wield power over the making of knowledge. And for that, I draw your attention to one of my movement teachers, the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, which is an incredible abolitionist organization here in LA. And they give us this really important concept called academic complicity, arguing that as we seek to dismantle systems and structures of harm, like racialized policing, so we have to think about how the knowledge systems underpinning these systems are actually being produced in our very universities, down the hall from our faculty offices. And that therefore the fight against race and class inequality has to take place not only in movements and communities, but also very much in our universities. So research justice is meant to be a reparative approach to these forms of academic complicity, harm, and extraction. And as I noted earlier at the start of my talk, I'm interested in research justice not just as a framework of principles, but actual practices. So I could spend all day talking about this slide, but I wanted to share some of these practices, and I hope we can come back to it in Q&A. These are some of the ways in which we have materialized research practice in our work. So we've sought to create a shared terrain of scholarship between universities and movements. So it's not universities produce knowledge, movements do organizing, but rather that we together produce knowledge. And so much of the research and scholarship I've done for the past 10 years has been homework given to me by universities, given to me by movements and communities. And I'm serious when I use the term homework. I can't do all the homework that is given to me. I say homework because my movement comrades will give me a grade, if you will. They're harder to please, I joke, than most peer reviewers in academia. But it also means that we take very seriously how our research processes must have not only university processes of IRB, but also community-based IRBs. In addition to academic peer review, we take very seriously and seek to create forms of community review. This means institutionalizing mechanisms of accountability. And I want to make a distinction here between accountability and reporting lines. So, in my role as Institute Director, I report to the Dean of the School of Public Affairs at UCLA, and I take that reporting line very seriously. But that is not the only form of accountability I have as Institute Director and in this work that I do. My accountability is to the movements and communities on the front lines of displacement and dispossession. And quite frankly, when reporting lines and these forms of accountability are in conflict with one another, I personally will choose these forms of accountability to movements and communities rather than the reporting lines of our universities. And this means very much refusing and challenging academic complicity, including the complicity of our very own disciplines and professions in these forms of harm. We've also spent a lot of time thinking about how all of this work needs to be resourced. And to do that, we've got to hack the bureaucracy of our universities, how we've got to make sure that people doing this work, even when they don't hold university degrees, are recognized by the university, not just through a title, but through actual material resources, which for me has often meant that we create academic appointments for our movement and community scholars. So the work I'm going to talk about has taken the form of what I've come to call insurgent research collectives. And I use the term insurgent research in two ways. I'm drawing on Adam Godry's notion of insurgent research as a counterpoint to extractive research and forms of research that recenter the community in the research process. But also, I use insurgent in the sense that so much of our work has been concerned with spatial insurgents in the city of Los Angeles and taking very seriously the role of poor people's movements and landless people's movements in reshaping the city. So let me share a little bit about this research and scholarship. Housing justice has been the focus of quite a bit of our work in these research collectives. And this work started with something called the After Echo Park Lake Research Collective, which formed in 2021 in the wake of a militarized eviction of an encampment that had formed during the pandemic in Echo Park Lake, which is an iconic public park in Los Angeles, really in the heart of what is now gentrified Los Angeles. The encampment had survived during the pandemic. People had built a community there, had taken care of each other, built a community garden, a community kitchen. And then in March 2021, 400 militarized police officers were sent in to dismantle the encampment and to disappear and scatter people. The then mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, declared this eviction as the largest and the most successful housing transition in the history of Los Angeles. The park itself came to be enclosed and fenced and barricaded and surrounded with surveillance cameras. So in the wake of that eviction, I joined with housed and unhoused organizers who had been active at Echo Park Lake to create the After Echo Park Lake Research Collective. And over the course of the next year, we were to meet at least once a week in the beautiful gardens of UCLA to undertake research with and regarding the people who had been displaced. We wanted to test the mayor's claim that everyone was going to be housed and that this was the most successful housing transition in the history of Los Angeles. It was a time of building collectivity and collaboration. Um, it was a time of doing so while people themselves were struggling with displacement, while people were facing all sorts of trauma, and yet we tried very much to find joy amidst the pandemic and amidst the disappearance and displacement. Our work resulted in an 80,000 word monograph that we as a collective um, wrote together. We analyzed data together. We undertook research together. We analyzed those research findings together. And I share with you just a summary of our key findings, um, which shows our ethnographic research showed that of the 84 people that we followed closely over the course of a year, only 4 were housed. And really, they were housed through our support. Um, as of 2022, when we released the report, 7 people had died, many more have died since. The city's own data, which we also had unusual access to, showed that of the 183 people that the mayor claimed that were going to be housed, only 17 were housed, and even those are no longer housed. But more importantly, that large numbers of people were simply disappeared. They were dropped from the housing rolls. And we saw this, therefore, to be a striking case of what we have come to call the ruse of housing. That in this case, and from this point on, the city of Los Angeles undertook encampment sweeps and evictions, claiming that people were going to be brought inside, that they were all going to be housed, that they were going to be permanently housed. But this liberal lie aided and legitimized violent forms of state displacement. In our ongoing work on these processes, we have come to call this permanent displaceability. And I'll come back to this in just a minute. But I also wanted to share with you the research methodologies because I see this to be a key part of research justice and a key part of what Professor Garcia invited me to talk about today. That how do we build research methodologies that are on the front lines of displacement and dispossession? So for us, it meant a few different things. It meant thinking not just about interviews, but really thinking about ethnographic processes that were life histories, right? And that meant thinking about displacement not just as the singular spectacular moment, but as iterative, as recursive, and therefore requiring us to take very seriously, right, these long life histories of dispossession and displacement. It meant, as I already have noted, paying close attention to state violence, including violence by liberal state actors using the progressive language of housing people, of providing shelter. Most recently, I've come to call this shelter and care liberalism. And you all know this, that urban planning and my other discipline, social welfare, are fully implicated, complicit, I would argue, in shelter and care liberalism. It was very important for us to think not only about displacement and dispossession, but to think also about how we connect life histories and movement histories. And just yesterday, we launched, in fact, the online archive, the online permanent community archive of the Echo Park Lake work. And you can find that on the Institute's website. We also, through an unusual data usage agreement with the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, which is the main public agency in LA charged with the management of homelessness, we've also had very unusual access to all of the administrative data on homelessness in Los Angeles. We're the only researchers to have fully identified data. And What we have tried to do is again take an insurgent approach to this administrative data, and some of this is evident in journal articles we have recently published, where in the state's data, we insist on seeing what the state refuses to see. That we are able to stitch together different pieces of that data precisely to create these life histories, these trajectories of housing, or rather trajectories of unhousing, if you will. Um, and so, in fact, what we have done in the Echo Park Lake work and now with other encampments in Los Angeles is also to think about how we can leverage our university positions to access public records, to access administrative data, including longitudinal administrative data, and how this work can be connected through our ethnographic data. Now, our research work with Echo Park Lake was important, but it took place in the context of what I have come to call an expanding regime of racial banishment. That militarized eviction in March 2021 marked a turning point in the city. For those of you thinking about New York, it was sort of our Tompkins Square Park moment, right? But what we began to see in Los Angeles was then a deepening of the criminalization of homelessness and a deepening of shelter and care liberalism as a way of justifying racial banishment, which posed for us this very difficult question, which I struggle with every day, which is, can research be a counterpoint to racial banishment? For us, taking on that question has meant journeying with movement formations. So quite a bit of our work unfolded as a homeless union was forming in Los Angeles, something called Attack on House Tenants Against Carceral Housing. And here you see two of my comrades on the steps of Los Angeles City Hall. In the foreground is Theo Henderson, who was activist in residence at the Institute and is an incredible intellectual. And in the background is Will Sense Jr., who's been a researcher at the Institute from 2021 until most recently. Will was a resident of the Echo Park Lake encampment and a key part of our research and archival projects. Here you see two, again, of my comrades, Jen Blake and Gustavo Otsoy, at the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, at one of the many meetings sparked by our research and by our report. Jen and I recently co-authored a piece that was just published in IJER called Common Sense Law. Gustavo, unfortunately, is no longer with us, and I'll return to Gustavo later in today's presentation. In thinking about whether research can be a counterpoint to racial banishment, we took very seriously poor people's solutions for homelessness and housing precarity. So you see here this poster created by Unhoused Tenants Against Carceral Housing at a press conference by then City Council member Mitch Farrell, who was really crucial in the eviction at Echo Park Lake. And you see City Hall solutions, right, to poverty and homelessness in Los Angeles, and you see Attack's solutions. And the ones put forward by unhoused folks might seem so obvious to us, and yet are so out of reach, even in our liberal cities like Los Angeles. I would say that our research report, that 80,000 word monograph, was successful in many ways. We made international headlines and national headlines, partly because the numbers were so dramatic that many of the media headlines, particularly those in The Guardian and in the LA Times, read, "More people died than were housed." And that is indeed the case. And we were able to create a community archive, both a physical archive at the Skid Row History Museum and Archive, and also now an online archive. in many ways fulfilling the demands of community members when they had first met with me and when I'd first proposed this research. And they had asked me for research that could serve as powerful testimony and enact justice in the face of displacement. And they'd also asked me to create an archive, one that would be permanent rather than fleeting. And yet, as I reflect on this work, as I think about our continuing work with encampments in Los Angeles, I also think about research justice as a vanishing point. Why do I call it a vanishing point? I call it a vanishing point because while our Echo Park Lake work shook things up in the power holding institutions of the city, from LASA to Los Angeles City Council, the liberal rules of housing that underpinned that eviction and enclosure became a blueprint for the governance of poverty in Los Angeles. And second, while the impact of our After Echo Park Lake research was indeed substantial, for me that impact was washed away, if you will, by the fact that we continued to lose members of our community. People steadily died, people steadily disappeared, and in fact, over the last few years, key members of our Echo Park Lake Research Collective have died. Gustavo, then Queen, and so our community archive became an altar, right? The community itself became a vanishing point. And as I noted earlier, what we have seen is an expanding regime of racial banishment. We take on these issues in a series of new articles published in various journals, from Antipode to EPD to IJER to Urban Affairs Review. And in it, we make a case about liberal urbanism and mass homelessness, arguing that displaceability by design has become one of the primary modes through which mass homelessness is being governed in liberal cities like Los Angeles. And I can talk more about this in Q&A. But I wanted to share a bit about how we've been thinking about research justice in this work, which is with a different encampment called Etna Street, which is an encampment that formed first in 2017 along the metro line in Van Nuys, which is a neighborhood in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles. So very, very different social geography than Echo Park Lake. And the Etna encampment has now been dismantled, but for a long time served as a key place of Black refuge and return in the valley. In working closely with housed and unhoused organizers in the valley, and particularly Etna residents accompanying them, we've had to think a great deal once again about insurgent research collectives. That means grappling with difficult questions around poor people's histories, subaltern ethnography, the insurgent appropriation and analysis of state data, of what it means to make right and make law from below, what it means to take seriously encampment geographies. And our work at Etna Street, which has been going on now since fall 2021, has raised again a whole set of questions about research justice and the role of research and scholarship in justice. So I wanted to share some of these. One of them is what I call research at gunpoint. The Etna Street encampment was dismantled and disappeared in 2023 by a program by the current mayor of Los Angeles, a program called Inside Safe, which claims to bring encampment residents inside housing. In the case of Etna Street, the eviction was again at gunpoint. Folks were loaded onto buses without knowing where they were going. They were placed in a motel where they lived for over a year. Several residents continued to live there. And Etna Street itself was enclosed and barricaded, very similar to Echo Park Lake. But what this meant then is that our research collective was very much doing research at gunpoint. So a few days after the enclosure and eviction at Etna Street, police forces continued to round up any unhoused folks who dared to be on the streets near Etna. So what you see here are police officers with their guns drawn at one of our unhoused comrades. You see another one of our unhoused comrades on the ground there. And what you now see as I zoom out of this shot, it's Carla Orendorff, a key member of our research collective, a co-author of mine on many of my writings, and Carla arguing with the police. What does it mean not only to do research at gunpoint, but what does it mean to live under gunpoint? Right? My second question, provoked by our work at Etna, is what does it mean when the encampment, or poor people's geographies, is no longer an object of study, but instead a place of study? And what then is the role of research and the formal university? I want to really challenge our notions of study, and I'm drawing here on the work of Robin D.G. Kelly and Professor Kelly's brilliant formulation of Black study as struggle, and a struggle that often is within a university but not of the university, right? But our comrades at Etna have challenged us to think not only about forms of study within the university, but in fact of the encampment as a place of study. Carla Orendorff, in fact, talks about encampments as the freedom schools of our city. So we decided to take this quite seriously by creating and teaching in 2023 a year-long urban planning graduate capstone course at UCLA. It was a course that I co-taught with Rashid Shabazz, who is a doctoral student at UCLA Urban Planning, and Carla Orendorff, whom I've mentioned before. This capstone course at UCLA is very unusual. It's called a community collaborative course. It's a year-long capstone that brings together urban planning master students doing their capstone work with community members, and it typically focuses on a year-long project. In our case, we partnered with the Etna Street encampment and brought urban planning graduate students together with Etna residents and organizers. Etna residents called the class a lab for liberatory projects. And it involved various projects. For example, a community plan and design for the encampment rooted in traditions and histories of self-determination, mutual aid, collective care, and commoning, and meant to serve as a counterpoint to the homeless industrial complex and its models of carceral shelter. There was a project focused on legal strategies undergirded by research to undo some of the municipal ordinances that are expanding the criminalization of homelessness. There was a people's land use plan to map and reimagine the control and use of vacant public land. Quite a bit of that vacant public land around the Etna Street encampment was owned and controlled by public agencies such as LA Metro. And Street Views, which is a publication that continues and that was undertaken by students to create a street newspaper in Los Angeles. And graduation day, we created our own graduation at the School of Public Affairs, was joyous, bringing together urban planning graduate students with our community participants. I particularly wanted to highlight this photograph. It's a photograph of Queen, who passed away a year later. And you see here Queen with her baby. This baby was literally born during our urban planning course. Queen came to our class every Wednesday evening, pregnant, told us one evening that she was going to go to the hospital and give birth, did that, and came back to class the next Wednesday with baby Adrian. So this is a very joyous and also very sad photograph for us. But what I wanted to point out is again this vanishing point of research justice, right? So this class, this community collaborative, fell apart many, many times. And it fell apart in ways that tell us something about research justice and the difficult practices of it. So indeed, as one of our Etna comrades asked us, yes, this class is well and fine, but what does it mean to have a class that prepares people for the shock of life as a poor person, as a homeless person? The class fell apart many times because there was bitter disagreement about the history of the Etna encampment, about who holds authority to tell the history of Etna. Etna residents sparred with each other in the collective and in the class. Some left the class upset that their histories were not prominent enough. Others pinned blame on community organizers, holding them responsible for uplifting certain voices over others. So the research collective in some ways had to be partitioned, the class had to be partitioned, work had to be divided up into subgroups. And what was interesting to me is that our urban planning graduate students became incredibly silent in the midst of all of this uproar. They became more and more silent. They became back row observers, right, to this community conflict. The class could only continue after we together learned the difficult lesson of epistemic deference. And that is a term I'm borrowing from philosopher Olufemi Taiwo. It is worth noting that while Taiwo was a graduate student at UCLA, they created a graduate student version of the Undercommons. But in this essay in particular, Taiwo argues that epistemic deference can be as problematic as forms of epistemic privilege. That these tactics of deference insulate us from connection with people. Put bluntly, if we cannot engage in argument or conversation, but particularly argument, with those who hold a different position of social privilege than us, then that is not respect. That is, in fact, a form of disrespect. So it took us the lesson of learning epistemic deference as a form of elite capture to begin to engage in disagreement and debate with one another. So the class did in fact do its work, but the third provocation that I wanted to share is that the community then remained cracked open. And the questions that had come up in the class became unbearable questions and remain unbearable questions. And I say unbearable because they cannot be resolved, but they can in fact be answered in different ways. Most importantly, I think we've come to see conflict, including community conflict, as a key part of research justice and as a site of abolitionist praxis. So how do we live with each other? How do we hold each other close across tremendous class difference, across racial difference, across gender difference, but also across conflict and disagreement? For us at the Institute and in this work of our insurgent research collectives, it has meant thinking together and writing together. And again, Etna has taught us that. This is Whitney's tent, which was always at the first tent on Etna Street. And I think it very much captured the bold rebellions of Etna Street, including the refusal of shelter and care liberalism. So for us, it has meant writing together, thinking together, has become our way of, um, of building together. These forms of writing have often been public scholarship about reparative public goods. And these forms of writing have become, in some ways, our answer to this question. What does the university owe an encampment? A question that Carla Orendorff has posed to us repeatedly in our work. Those forms of writing have sometimes taken the kinds of writing that planners know how to do. You write to people who hold power. You rage in those forms of writing. You provide alternative plans. You analyze the data, right? In the case of the Echo Park Lake work, some of that writing had an impact. I would say in the case of Etna, it has not shifted forms of power. It has not shifted shelter and care liberalism. So we've been thinking about other forms of power, and I'm so delighted that literally as of 6 a.m. this morning, this book is complete and will be published on November 3rd. It is a book written by Etna residents and Etna organizers. It's being published by Common Notions Press. And it is a book that is about encampments as resistance and revolutionary care in LA, but it is very much about writing together. So in this book, I have a chapter called The Vanishing Point of Research Justice, and I wanted to, in closing, just share with you one piece from that. I write in that chapter that these forms of writing have been public scholarship about reparative public goods. This book is one such effort. These forms of writing have been collective, although these collectives have been frayed and strained. The actual process of writing across the divides of university, movement, and encampment has been challenging. For some of our authors, it has required the overwhelming narration of trauma and suffering. For some of our authors, it has required choosing one story of Etna over many others. For some of our authors, it has meant wrestling with the question, what is the point? I believe in writing. I believe in writing as a form of living. I think of writing in public as homework given to the public university by those consigned to living in public. I think of writing in public as a form of radical relationality that is at the very core of research justice. I think of writing in public as repair. So in closing, I want to share with you one redesign of the public university by my dear comrade Gustavo Otzoy, who was also a resident of the Echo Park Lake encampment and absolutely the very heart of our work in building the Echo Park Lake Research Collective and Archive Collective. Gustavo Otzoy died alone in his tent on Skid Row a couple of years ago. Gustavo believed in writing in the public university, in research, more than I will ever believe. And here is Gustavo. He always loved carrying the tote bags of the Institute. But you see that he has redesigned the tote bag with this wonderful little sticker given to him by the LA Community Action Network, one of our movement teachers. And it says, "Fuck the police, except you, officer." And Gustavo has a big smile on his face as he poses for me with this tote bag. When Gustavo died, people, in sorting through his few belongings, were reminded of how much Gustavo loved to write, but he also loved to write signs. And one of the signs he left us was this sign that shared sort of, for him, the human rights organizations that he worked with, including UCLA. I'm not sure I would put my own university on a list of human rights organizations, along with the LA Tenants Union and Street Watch and the ACLU, but Gustavo did. He believed in research and scholarship and in the work of universities more than I do, and that is homework that I will always carry with me. Thank you all.
Well, thank you so much, Ananya, and for sharing so many amazing stories. And yes, we have lots of applauses, and this is a time for questions. And we have like quite a bit of time. So about like 40 minutes for it. So just like feel free to unmute yourself. We can also like do the chat as well, but preferably if you can unmute yourself, that'll be great. Thank you so much. Oh yeah, I see a hand already. It's Prakriti.
That's right. My question is about the early phases of organization, organizing the people and getting researchers and the community on board with a similar vision and identifying that vision. How did that look like?
Yes, thank you, Prakriti, for that question. So with Echo Park Lake, as this spectacular eviction unfolded, and it unfolded over the course of 2 nights, I, as a researcher, immediately recognized that it was a turning point. As I said earlier, it felt like a Tompkins Square Park moment, and I was like, what is going on? I had not been connected to the organizing at Echo Park Lake until then. I organized initially what many of us know how to organize, which is a letter by experts, okay, faculty experts from different universities in Los Angeles, the special rapporteurs, former and current at the United Nations, sort of calling out the city administration and calling out the mayor for this eviction, right? We took that letter, we took it to the mayor, we met with the deputy mayor, we met with the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, but it immediately became evident to me that these organizing letters, of course, were not going to be sufficient, and that what was really needed here was a deep engagement with the folks who'd actually been displaced. And for me, then, that meant beginning to meet with folks who were Echo Park Lake residents, as well as the folks who'd been organizing with them. I remember a series of first meetings. Gustavo and Queen were very present. In sort of literally outside the fences of the park. And my questions were around whether such research was useful or meaningful for folks. Should we even undertake it? If we did, what were the terms of that research? Would they be participants in that research, not objects of the research? What would be the terms of that participation? Remember, this was also during the pandemic, so we had to think very much about how we could gather. But most importantly, I wanted to understand the aspirations of folks for the research. And actually, people gave me very clear guidelines for the research. I mean, they wanted the research, they wanted to be a part of it. They showed up every week at UCLA for it. But the two pieces of homework I got, one, that they wanted the research to be rigorous, so rigorous that it could serve as testimony in human rights litigation. Now, that litigation never really happened, right? But it could really sort of serve as rigorous testimony. And second, that recognizing that they had been already being scattered and disappeared, that the research take place in a way that people remain connected to one another. And that later became this aspiration for a community archive, for a permanent community archive. So with Etna, it was a different process, right? So I think this is very much about thinking about what the goals of research might look like in this shared terrain of universities, communities, and movements.
Thank you very much. I quite enjoyed learning from your lecture.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so there's a question in chat, if is that I can take on. Kimberly, thank you for this question. It's a really important one. Um, so yes, I think yes. So our universities are not necessarily hospitable to this kind of research, right? They are typically hostile to this kind of research. This kind of research is also what I like to call slow research. It takes a long time. Um, the publications often take the form of public scholarship, takes the form of community archives, forms of research and scholarship that are not recognized by our universities. And this is a huge challenge for early career researchers, right? Now, as we undertake these research projects, I think it's also crucial, particularly for those of us who are no longer early career researchers, to transform the standards of research and scholarship and the recognition of this research and scholarship at our university. So at UCLA, there's been this multi-year endeavor to establish the recognition of community engaged scholarship, not a term I would use, but to recognize community engaged scholarship in tenure and promotion cases, right? And I think this is going to be really important as it gets institutionalized, because in fact, it also provides guidelines for internal and external reviewers to take account of this research, of the slow nature of this research, of the unusual publication patterns of this research, but also to give the researchers the opportunity to narrate their work, to explain what they mean by impact, how they've created these research collectives, who the community is, and so forth. But I think that there are also, I think that some also important additional points that you raise. So for us, our research collectives have brought together people with different levels of privilege and vulnerability. We've always been very explicit about that. And we have also, I think, had considerable conflict about how we navigate this. So, for example, when we undertake peer review, right? In response to reviewers, it is not that I write those responses to reviewers on my own, but there's certain kinds of work that I undertake that I would not expect the other members of the collective, right? Do they really have to navigate the Scholar One manuscript system? No, I can do that. I think in terms of vulnerability, we've thought a lot about whether this research makes people more vulnerable, say, to state violence. And if so, how we might, in fact, create forms of anonymity and protection. The folks who have publicly been a part of these research collectives will argue that being a part of these research collectives, having their names publicly available, has in fact given them a bit more traction in relation to some of these state agencies. And you'll see us writing quite explicitly about that and also about how unfair all of that can be, right? But I think that the burden of this research, and it shouldn't be a burden, unfortunately still lies with justice-oriented scholars, and the recognition that this work deserves is still rather scant from our universities. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that Ariel was talking or doing a response also that some universities are developing some criteria for community engaged research for tenure and promotion. And then we have like a question from Jeff, and he says, Ananya, can you elaborate on what you talked about in the previous response? How did you set up, ensure rigorous research work that could be used in litigation? I'm curious about the methods, data keeping aspects here, especially across people that perhaps have different experiences doing that or not.
Yes, Ariel, thank you for sharing that. Jeff, thank you for that question. So, as I mentioned earlier, the folks at Echo Park Lake aspired to undertake human rights litigation around that displacement. That never materialized. But there've been really important legal challenges to the criminalization of homelessness that have come from Skid Row organizations that we've worked with closely and from the Etna encampment. The main litigation around the Los Angeles Municipal Ordinance 5611. So 5611 restricts the personal belongings of homeless persons, right? And it empowers the city, notably police and sanitation, to seize belongings in excess of a 60-gallon limit, and also empowers the city to criminalize those resisting that seizure. The main legal challenge to that is a case called Janet Garcia versus City of Los Angeles. Janet Garcia is a former resident of the Etna encampment. This has been a lawsuit that has dragged out for years and years and years, led by some of the city's best public interest attorneys like Shayla Myers. And so the work, sort of both the life history work, the ethnographic work, people's experiences of the state violence, as well as sort of our analysis of administrative data, are both very relevant to these sorts of legal challenges. Much of the work, though, that we've done as an institute in relation to sort of the terrain of legal struggle has been in the form of amicus briefs. So right as the pandemic hit, Gary Blasey, who is Professor Emeritus of Law and the OG of Public Interest Law in LA, did a landmark report called UD Day that calculated the possible scale of evictions in Los Angeles if rent relief and eviction moratorium protections were not put into place. UD Day forms the basis of amicus briefs that around the country as well as in Los Angeles. And that kind of amicus brief work has been really important for us. And I will say that a whole line of work that I didn't present here, which has to do with nuisance law, was direct homework to us from public interest attorneys, including Shayla Myers, where we then did a public records request of the city attorney's office, got all of the nuisance lawsuits, analyzed that, and that analysis has formed the basis of legal challenges to nuisance law in Los Angeles. So there are many different aspects of this work.
Darren, you have a question?
Yes. Thank you, Ifis. Thank you, SCSP, for organizing this insightful lecture. Thank you, Ananya. So my question to you, you mentioned in your presentation about institutionalized mechanism of accountability. And yeah, your work, remarkable work with Echo Park. Of course, you mentioned about displacement and dispositions. Here in DFW, I'm from UT Arlington, this huge area with 8.2 million. And we Of course, we also have some encampment here, right, in Texas. But we have also some, I would say, informality through exclusion. We have unincorporated freedmen settlement. At least I have here in Sand Branch, in Dallas, or Stop 6 here in Fort Worth. I know your work in the initial of your career, early career on informality. So now, since I'm here in UT Arlington, accountability, just like you said, right? So how you can frame this accountability if we also have that informality through exclusion in the area?
Yes, thank you for that question. So look, when I talked about institutionalized practices of accountability, I meant it as a practice of research justice, that as we undertake what I'm calling research justice, but that we often call community engaged scholarship, right? There are different ways in which people think about that accountability. Community advisory boards are a common way in which that happens. We've had our community advisory boards, but I don't think they're sufficient. So for us, it has meant collectivizing research. Now, collectivizing research is very difficult when some members of the collective are living under conditions of great precarity, right? And when they are being constantly disappeared. I mean, we have been working literally with encampments that are being disappeared or in the wake of disappearance as people are being scattered, right? So in some ways, the research collective has been a place that has held together the community, but it has not been able to bear that weight also, if you will. So for us, it has meant thinking constantly about what these mechanisms are. In the broader work of the Institute, it has meant, for example, taking very seriously the role of movement scholars and encampment scholars in determining the future of our work, in reviewing grant proposals. So, we give out grants to faculty and students. Those review panels are made up not just of UCLA faculty, but are made up also, right, of movement scholars. We take very seriously in our freedom schools and sort of summer institutes that we've had that our teachers, right, are not just university-based scholars, but are also very much movement and community scholars. From the very start, the Institute has had an activist in residence program that is meant to create a sabbatical for movement scholars at the university, but is also meant to remind us all that these too are our teachers. So this is what I mean by these institutionalized mechanisms of accountability, right? That it is not just an interpersonal relationship of accountability, which is also important, right? But that we need to institutionalize these mechanisms. And we really need to take seriously that community advisory board or the community review as much as we would our reporting line to our deans and chairs. Now, how all of that works, as you point out, under conditions of state violence and the disappearance of people is precisely both the challenge at hand and the urgent necessity of research justice, right? That we can't do this only with in-placed communities, right? We've got to be able to do this with communities that are constantly enduring racial banishment.
Well, thank you for the question, Darren. We have one question from Sophie. It says, I appreciate your questions, comments about being held accountable versus lines of reporting, and that when facing the conflict between choosing lines of reporting or accountability with the community, you choose the community. How would you advise young academics entering the university setting to do this when we are also up against the business model of academia? How can we challenge universities to be more open and actively seeking the accountability from the community rather than prioritizing publication, meeting publication metrics targets. So that's one question. And then the other one is, like, you mentioned that the Edna community was cracked open and that the master students become more passive in this process. Did you unpack that with the master students? How can educators better equip younger researchers with the necessary interpersonal skills to do deep ethnographic research that might also cause conflict or tension in the process? These are amazing questions. Sophie, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sophie. And I'll take on the first one. And with the second one, I see Rashid here in this space. And Rashid was co-teacher of that class. So Rashid, if you feel comfortable in joining me in answering that second question, please do. So I will say that, yes, I mean, look, you're absolutely right. And this goes back to Kimberly's question also about early career researchers. It is not easy to challenge these established structures of reporting, and especially when there is conflict. So I will say that, the last couple of years, our activist in residence program has come under attack, as universities themselves come under attack. And I often joke, and it's not funny actually, that UCLA wants to promote the activist in residence program as, oh wow, look at this incredible program of community engagement, and community engagement is now number one in UCLA's strategic plan. And yet UCLA is very willing to go along with all the right-wing forces and right-wing think tanks that are attacking our activists in residence, right? UCLA is not offering any particular protection to our activists in residence. We are having to devise literally abolitionist systems of keeping each other safe. So our universities in particular will again turn community engaged scholarship into something that is extractive and performative, right? And we have to be vigilant about that. And we have to think about what we're able to challenge. So I will say particularly for young academics, early career scholars, I would say that building strength through organizing, right? And by organizing, I don't simply mean faculty unions, though those are really important, but really thinking about how you find your people in academia, right? I will say it's also important for us to write. Whether that writing takes the form of academic scholarship or not, traditional academic scholarship or not, I think it's important for us to think about the power we hold in writing, including in writing in ways that exposes, right, our universities, not as sort of a typical expose, but really as a critical analysis of the systems of power, right, that shape our work. And I think that I'm really grateful for this space together, because I think the more of these conversations and really intergenerational conversations we have, right, the more we can build space within organizations like ACSB to do this work. Rashid, I don't know if you would like to take on question two. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if that is of interest to you, please do. Otherwise, I can answer it.
Peace, Ananya, and peace, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really interested in your perspective on it because we haven't talked about it in a few years. But what I'll share about it is just observing that process. So, just my perspective on this dynamic was, and maybe in a lot of urban planning programs, there are people who, come to it for different reasons. Maybe it's lived experience, and I think we can also assume people have certain privilege. And then some of us as masters and graduate students, we like, yeah, I don't feel that privilege eating pizza and, top ramen or whatever. But, a plain way I would make this is you have a scenario where homelessness is racialized, and a lot of students, white students, various economic backgrounds, but a number of people come to find out we're fairly secure in some situations where they can even come to graduate school. And so then there's an assumption, if you don't have this lived experience, then this person who's living here, I don't want to, especially in urban planning where we've come, hopefully so far from, these models of planning where there are certain experts. And so then the assumption is, oh, okay, I'm just going to defer to this person. And so I think that's what I heard in this. It got cracked open where there are people who are saying, I care about this thing, and so this should be the priority. When in fact, as Ananya mentioned, there were different fissures or different conflicts among people. And so if you're ceding authority, morality to one single person or a faction, if you will, I don't think they were necessarily factions, but it wouldn't necessarily, I think, be that beneficial. And so then how do you have that conversation? And I think what I learned from Ananya with that, I'm the type of person, I go back and forth between being very blunt and then being overly diplomatic. And I think, Ananya, what I learned from you in that scenario was you can be real without being rude is a lesson I'm learning. And what I mean by that is you just made it plain. You put the mirror up on some of the behavior, the practice where people were, master students in particular, were just deferring to whatever, despite, people maybe not being present or whatever the different challenges were. And I think the other part, I think you framed, I'm thinking of, particular behavior. I'm not going to identify the person, but I think you framed the deference is a lack of accountability on that person's part. So like what does it mean for an unhoused person who has to come all the way to, UCLA, literally from the street, to still be accountable for this commitment and the voices that they can represent and claim to represent. And so I think in that process, you just made it really plain and we had real conversations with folks about that in collective, individual. And I think that helped people to get over, if it wasn't fear, hesitancy to just say, actually, I think we should do this, or we've been working on this thing for a few months and we're glad you're back, but we want to proceed with this particular thing. But that's my recollection from that time and that period.
Thank you, Rashid. And I think that also speaks to the question that Deepa's posed also in chat.
Deep, I don't know if you wanted to say anything else about your question.
Yeah, hi, thank you. No, I think I really like the articulation just now about how you dealt with the thing in situ. So thank you so much.
And we have one more question from Leslie. Do you want to verbalize your question, Leslie? Should I read it? Okay, first of all, thank you so much for sharing such valuable insights on our research justice framework. As a PhD student in Texas, where many of us are currently navigating increasing high levels of surveillance and political scrutiny, I wonder what recommendations you will offer to those of us who want to continue developing and strengthening our research justice and practices and skills. You talk also maybe reflect on the importance of creating non-academic spaces beyond the university where young researchers can continue this kind of political, ethical, and community engaged training. What resources, networks, or spaces would you recommend for those interested in moving in that direction?
Thank you for that question, Leslie. So these are really difficult times, and they're especially difficult times in places like Texas, right? I don't want to say they're unprecedented times, but I think what makes it especially difficult is that this is not just an attack on universities and on the work that many of us do from afar. So this is not just an attack by Washington, D.C. institutions on our universities, right? This is sort of an unmaking of the university from within. And it's a project that has been in the making for a long time, right? And Texas reminds us of that. So I think, more broadly, I have been thinking about this as sort of the returns of racial fascism, but really also as the returns of racial liberalism, by which I mean, and I'm thinking here with scholars like Alberto Toscano, who in turn are drawing on the work of Black radical thinkers like Angela Davis, that fascism has always existed within the color lines of US liberal democracy, right? And that's what we're really seeing manifested. Dylan Rodriguez calls this white reconstruction. That's what we're seeing manifested, right? And universities are very much at the center of it. So I would say that we all have to be acutely aware of the forms of surveillance, right, and scrutiny that we're all under. I'm just going to say this because I actually say this to all my students. I've had a Department of Justice order against all my emails, texts, WhatsApp communications. Indefinitely, all of it a sweeping order for the last year and a half. So anything you write to me, text to me, send to me is turned over by UCLA to the Department of Justice on all my devices, okay? So please don't send me anything that you don't want DOJ to read. I say this because this kind of lawfare and this kind of sort of extortionary surveillance, right, has also sort of bubbled up within our universities. And so it is not just DOJ reading my emails, it is that our own colleagues and comrades, right, are a part of these systems of surveillance. It means that our work is more important than ever before, but how we share our work possibly has to change. I think we've got to be much more attentive to how we keep each other safe, how we think about different levels of vulnerability, right? How we share information or not, right? It's definitely changed the ways in which we at the Institute share our work. And I think that's the case more broadly. But I also think we've got to think about how we archive the work, how we think about radical archiving and networking practices, right? And there is a lot to learn from other parts of the world that have endured fascism, right? And that have found ways of staying connected and making knowledge under conditions of authoritarian rule, right? Where attacks on universities have been a key part of that authoritarianism. And I will say that precisely as you point out, Leslie, I think it's important for us to build within and beyond universities, right? So for me, building within universities has been important. Organizing against the university is important. I will say here at UCLA and in the UC system, faculty organizing is at an all-time high. The Faculty Association of the University of California is the one who's repeatedly dragged the Trump regime to court, and we have won. Our university administrations have been cowards. They have not taken the Trump administration to court over the cancellation of federal grants and other things. We have, and we've won, and we will continue to win. The AAUP has been reinvigorated, right? So all of that traditional form of organizing matters, but building spaces outside of our universities is important. And along with Barbara Ransby and Kathy Cohen and Devarian Baldwin and Lorgia Garcia Pena, I've had the great privilege of building with Scholars for Social Justice, including building something that we're calling the Freedom and Justice Institute, and we resource early career scholars. We just have an RFP out. I'm just looking it up so I can share it with you. RFP out for funding research collaboratives around two themes: transforming the Jim Crow University and radical left municipalism. And, I think that we all can think about how we want to build and strengthen these networks. And, what it means to do so in ways that are not fully public at the moment, but that nevertheless builds community. And I'm just going to drop this in chat. If you're interested in applying, please do.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Ananya. I wanted to say that your talk comes to me in a particular timing where I actually was with Leslie doing some field work, and we're doing some field work right now. We are working with a housing advocacy group that we worked a lot with. So we have a long-term partnership, which is like Texas Housers. And we're doing a research where we go to people's homes after their homes were rebuilt after Hurricane Harvey. And people are having problems with these homes. The other day, like on Wednesday, I met this like lady that her home, is kind of like sinking and tilted. So there's like structural problems are a pretty issue, and it's an African American woman. It's also a blind woman. And she has struggled a lot to contact people and people reaching back. She said, like, I don't know what else to do. My next step is litigation, right? And then with the people in Texas Housers, we are like, they said, do not say that that's what you're doing, because we can help people in the future with our research. But we want to do community organizing and then do public information requests. And maybe that results in litigation. But we don't want to say that when we go to the field, kind of like making promises to people, because that also causes issues with like trust. Like we said that we would do something and then it doesn't happen to go that way. Like what we do is usually, like as you said, produce research that can speak right to those issues and potentially result in litigation. But I found it like very encouraging, right? Because like we can be transparent to talk about communities and doing that work and see where it goes and how see it through, right? And sometimes, personally, I feel like, I don't have any power to actually help people. And I imagine that in your work, it's like, you cannot. Through your partnership, there was people that were housed, but the majority of people are not, right? And many of them even die, right? And that's like very disheartening as well when you're part of that and you feel a little bit like powerless, right? But you have to remember that you have some power and then work towards that and keep building your partnerships. And yeah, so I find your talk very inspiring. So thank you. Thank you so much. And then on that note, talking about or research and how we can make our research like impactful. There'll be like a talk which is like next. It's on June 5th from 11 a.m. This is CST to 12:30, and this is about writing for. We have someone from the conversation. They do a lot of articles that are like academic, and they have partnerships with particular universities, not with all, but it could be good to see like how to write like a non-academic in order to get like Ananya like with the LA Times and have your research actually have impact and being in the conversation. So potentially again that results in advocacy or that has positive outcomes for the people that you're working with. So I invite you to that talk. Also, I wanted to say, like, if you have ideas for talks or you yourself would like to do a talk, please like just email me and we will organize a talk so we can all keep cultivating our mentorship for growth. Again, thanks so much, Ananya, for your wisdom, for your encouragement, for your mentorship, and thank you.
Thank you so much for organizing. Thank you, everyone, for being here and the great questions.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye.